Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Shemmassian, admissions expert and founder of Shemmassian Academic Consulting. Usually on this channel, I answer commonly asked questions and share strategies to help you get into your dream program. But today, I want to talk about something that's personally meaningful to me: life with Tourette syndrome. If you've been watching the channel, you may have noticed my repetitive facial movements or tics, and some of you have even correctly identified Tourette syndrome as the cause of these tics. In this video, I'm going to share my story about living with Tourette syndrome and answer some questions I frequently receive about my experience with Tourette's. So what is Tourette syndrome? Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder characterized by repetitive, stereotyped, and involuntary movements and vocalizations called tics. Some examples of motor tics include making facial grimaces, blinking a certain way, shrugging your shoulders, twisting your wrists, and moving your neck. Examples of vocal tics include making a sound or repeating a word or phrase. Yep. Like I mentioned earlier, for something to be classified as a tic, it has to be repetitive, meaning it happens over and over again. It has to be stereotyped, meaning it happens in the same way each time. And it has to be involuntary, meaning that it's uncontrollable. Now, people with Tourette syndrome can suppress their tics, but only for a short period, like a few seconds. While a lot of people tic, a Tourette syndrome diagnosis is made only when a person has exhibited 2 distinct motor tics and 1 vocal tic at some point, though not necessarily at the same time. Moreover, the tics have to be present for at least 1 year and before age 18. A key point here is that while everyone with Tourette syndrome has tics, not everyone with tics has Tourette syndrome because they fail to meet the remaining diagnostic criteria. When was I diagnosed with Tourette syndrome? I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome around ages 8 to 9, which is quite common. However, I started exhibiting tics around age 7. My parents even recall me clearing my throat more than other kids as an infant, so there might have been earlier signs. Unfortunately, I had to see a number of physicians before my condition was correctly diagnosed. My pediatrician thought it was a much more serious condition and referred me to an adult neurologist who called it a bad habit. Finally, a pediatric neurologist identified it as Tourette syndrome within a minute or 2 of speaking with and observing me. Not knowing why I was ticcing was very scary for my parents and me. Despite a bunch of people telling me it was just a bad habit, I couldn't stop. We wondered if my tics would get worse. They did for a while, and whether my health was at risk. Receiving the correct diagnosis and learning that my health was not compromised in any way was a huge relief for all of us. Is Tourette syndrome a mental illness? Tourette syndrome is not exactly a mental or psychiatric illness. It's more correctly classified as a movement disorder or a neurological disorder. A big part of the misconception about Tourette syndrome being a mental illness comes from the following 2 points. Number 1, Tourette syndrome is often diagnosed by a psychiatrist. However, it can also be diagnosed by a psychologist, neurologist, or a pediatrician. Second, Tourette syndrome is largely misunderstood by the public. It's also taken a long time for the disorder to be understood by the medical and mental health communities, even if there's still a lot to uncover. Historically, when a condition has largely been a mystery, it's been misclassified as mental illness. What causes Tourette syndrome? The exact cause of Tourette syndrome is unknown. However, scientists have found genetic or inherited and environmental links. More specifically, there are genetic combinations that lead to the abnormal development of certain brain areas like the basal ganglia and frontal cortex, which also have atypical connections to one another. In addition, disturbances in certain neurotransmitter systems like dopamine and serotonin lead to communication problems between nerve cells, otherwise known as neurons. Collectively, these abnormalities lead to an uncomfortable feeling in a body part, known as a premonitory urge, that the person with Tourette syndrome gets rid of by ticking. Because the person feels better, the ticking is negatively reinforced, making it more likely to happen over and over again. Abnormalities in some of the brain areas and neurotransmitter systems that have been linked to Tourette syndrome are also seen in other mental health conditions, which is why Tourette syndrome is frequently comorbid with other disorders like ADHD and OCD. Why don't I curse? A common misconception about people with Tourette syndrome is that they all curse. But in fact, involuntary swearing, or coprolalia, only occurs in about 10% of people diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. Personally, I've never experienced coprolalia. And while I no longer experience vocal tics, I had brief periods during my youth when I gently cleared my throat or made a slightly high-pitched sound like But that hasn't stopped tons of people from asking me how I could have Tourette syndrome if I don't curse. A few years ago, a supermarket cashier asked me if I was okay after observing my facial tics. When I told him that I was fine and that my tics are due to Tourette syndrome, he jokingly put his arms up and said, "Whoa, don't cuss me out now." My wife, who was standing next to me, wasn't too happy about it, but I let it roll off my back. I've pretty much heard it all before. So what is it like living with Tourette syndrome? During elementary and middle school, I used to tic much more intensely, which led to a lot more stares and teasing than I receive today. In addition, a number of teachers called me out in front of class for faking my condition, and even told me I would amount to little, which was incredibly embarrassing and hurtful. An interesting fact about Tourette syndrome, and this is certainly the case for me, is that tics can often be suppressed for longer periods when the person is involved in a highly engaging focused activity, like playing basketball or playing video games. My tics have become much less uncomfortable over time, and they bother me little today. I know when I'm about to tic and usually let it happen anyway. I've also had Tourette syndrome for so long that I don't really remember life before it. Frankly, the biggest issue for me has not been the tics themselves, but rather the negative social feedback. People often ask if I'm okay or think I'm somehow less capable. This used to bring me down, but I now see it as a blessing since I get to educate folks about Tourette syndrome. I'm in a fortunate position where my tics have always been mild to moderate and never crossed over into the severe end of the spectrum. There are some individuals with Tourette syndrome with much more impairing symptoms, whose lives, I imagine, have been impacted much more negatively by the condition. Is there a cure for Tourette syndrome? There is no cure for Tourette syndrome, but there are many treatment options available, including medication and psychotherapy. A specific type of therapy known as habit reversal training, or HRT, is especially effective for reducing tics. When I was younger, I tried taking a few different medications. Some are more helpful than others in reducing tics, but the negative side effects of the most helpful ones, like serious weight gain, weren't worth it to me. Of course, everyone with Tourette syndrome has to decide whether medication is right for them based on their symptom severity, level of impairment, and so on. But therapies like HRT don't really come with negative side effects and are worth a shot. How can you support someone who has Tourette syndrome? While I can only speak for myself, I've observed that many people with Tourette syndrome are willing to discuss how their condition impacts them and to otherwise educate others. Moreover, people with Tourette syndrome really just want to be treated like everyone else instead of a weirdo or outcast. My advice is to be curious and ask people with Tourette syndrome what their experience is like, but otherwise interact with members of the Tourette syndrome community as you would with anyone else. We have the same hopes, fears, and dreams. I hope you found this video valuable. If you have any questions about Tourette syndrome or my experience with it, please leave them in the comments below and I'll respond soon. And of course, if you have any questions about admissions, you can leave those in the comments as well. I'd be glad to answer them. Take care.